In this episode, we're joined by Melissa Lowe from NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. She will share insights on climate change mitigation, carbon credits, alternative energy, and how we can all contribute to a sustainable future.
Hi everyone, we've got another great podcast for you today. Today we are in our third season, Sustainability, and we have the pleasure of welcoming Melissa Lowe today for another great talk on this issue. Melissa's a research fellow at the National University of Singapore, the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, but she's also serves as the chair of the Climate Action SG Alliance, and she's previously worked at the Energy Studies Institute and in many places, and her research area focuses on climate change. So thank you so much, Melissa. Welcome and great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So just to start off, because we're now on the topic of sustainability and this whole issue of environmentalism, and I think people might be a little bit fuzzy or confused about this because you catch snippets of things from the news or from what people are saying and doing, but they sound like they're in different directions. Like, what is environmentalism? I mean, is it saving endangered species? You go out there and protect the whales. Mm-hmm. Are you cleaning the beaches and the rivers of plastics? What is this? It seems like so many different things.
Absolutely, right? It seems, as you say, it seems like so many things. Perhaps what I can say about what is environmentalism is really I can start from the state of our planet. Right now, what we're seeing is a triple planetary crisis, right? So there's the climate crisis, which we know about, mm-hmm. right? Temperatures are warming way faster than it ever should be mm-hmm. because of man-made climate change. We're spewing out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's also biodiversity loss, mm-hmm. right? So we're losing our natural species, whether it's flora or fauna, right. Again, at an accelerated rate because of human development.
Okay.
We're also facing unprecedented levels of pollution, whether it's air, water, and so on.
Right.
So this is the triple planetary crisis.
I see.
So naturally, anyone who considers themselves an environmentalist, myself included, mm-hmm. Are concerned about any of these three areas. And increasingly, I think what's confusing for people out there is that environmentalists are also not just talking about the environment. Mm-hmm. They start to also talk about intersectional issues, right? Workers' rights, justice for all. And so that's what makes things a bit more confusing as well.
Right.
Like, why are these climate activists out there suddenly talking about workers out there in the heat?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess if you think of it as a warming planet and people who have to work outdoors and they don't have much rights, they will be the ones who suffer the worst. But yeah, it really isn't quite environmentalism. I mean, in a way it
stems from environmentalism, and then the concern spills over into other areas. And obviously for authorities, it's a bit like, oh no, right? Mm-hmm. It's a bit like the Singaporean fishball stick analogy, where whose jurisdiction does it come under?
Right.
Fair
enough.
Yeah, so workers will be under like MOM, right? Ministry of Manpower. But it's an environmental issue. It most likely will come under the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, mm-hmm. right? So these are interesting developments in the last few years that kind of make us sit and wonder, like, okay, so what exactly is environmentalism? So I see the point of the question.
Right. So and that also brings up an interesting sort of point where, let's say you were talking about workers and their rights and working in the heat and stuff like that. Those are part of, I suppose, what we would call mitigation concerns. That means the world is changing in a certain way and it's going to affect our way of life. Mm. And how do we deal with it? How do we adapt with it? Especially, things like when the sea levels rise and then you start to lose parts of the island and stuff like that. But then there's also the other part of it, which is, well, you shouldn't just ignore what's happening and try to adapt to it. Can we deal with what's happening, stop it, reverse it, or at least, prevent it from getting so bad, right? So that's the first part. How would you describe that? It would be prevention?
If we primarily are talking about the climate crisis, right, mm-hmm. one of the three planetary crises, I would say right now the world is very much focused on mitigation, so trying to reduce the rate of greenhouse gas increases. Mm-hmm. So whether you like it or not, the world cannot just stop burning fossil fuels. We can't just stop operating, right?
Yeah.
We live,
at least not
play.
Not in the near future.
Not in the
Maybe
near future,
at some point down the road possibly.
But even then, I think nobody's really talking about zero,
Sure.
right? They're talking about net zero,
Okay.
where they can find some other place where it's more cost effective to reduce emissions
Okay.
and then procure those offsets for their own use. But nobody is really saying that we can do zero or even negative, right? Even if there were, I think the planetary crisis, as I mentioned, so that sinks, right? So we talk about carbon sinks. These ecosystems are also under threat because of the warming planet,
Yep,
right? So we think that there might be a risk of some of these forests or other ecosystems having a reduced rate of efficiency
Sure.
because the planet has warmed so much and they cannot absorb as much
Sure.
carbon, which is very scary.
Yeah, I need to stop you at this point
Yes.
because you've mentioned something which I think the average person might not understand what it's about. I'm assuming when you say a carbon sink, it's like something that naturally absorbs carbon in a way so that you can pump out carbon and the environment is able to handle it because it takes it back. And the obvious thing is plants,
Yes,
they use
trees.
carbon dioxide
Yes,
to
and
do,
the ocean.
and the ocean to
Yeah.
some degree, but because of the life in the ocean that also use the carbon dioxide
That's right.
and so on,
Yeah.
right? It's not just
Yeah.
trapping it, but it's actually using it as part of this process. But there's a point beyond which you can produce so much
Correct.
carbon dioxide that the natural amount that it can take has been exceeded. And then
Exactly.
you end up like they're sort of full and it's not...
So the planet's adaptive capacity is also under threat, essentially, right? So while we're trying to mitigate, meaning like we're trying to reduce the emissions that we're putting out to the atmosphere, we cannot also not think about the adaptation because
Sure.
even if we stopped emitting today, which I mentioned earlier, we're not thinking
Right.
of doing anytime soon.
And even if we did.
The world will continue, the atmosphere will continue to warm because the fact that the greenhouse gases will continue to warm the atmosphere.
That means the stuff that we've done
Yes.
for years
going to
is continuing to be... So the sins of the past will
wreak havoc.
haunt us
Exactly.
for decades.
Exactly.
Really. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that's of concern, grave concern. And so therefore countries and businesses are all talking about climate resilience. I mean, there's the advent of the ESG reporting, disclosure. It's because of climate risk, actually, right? People have to understand the material risk to their portfolio moving forward. And eventually, I think banks will also start to think, if they're not already thinking about how to structure loans and deals based on the risk. But maybe we'll get into that a bit later.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but that's the part which I was going to zoom in a bit more because so what we understand clearly, the science is undisputed, is that the world is going to continue to warm, and there's literally nothing we can do to change that right now because of all the things that has already been done. And we're continuing to do, as you said, we can't suddenly just turn off all of the coal plants in the world and stop driving, gasoline cars and stuff like that. Which means that going forward, we're going to continue to make the problem worse for the foreseeable future. And we know that global warming is not just, it's a bit warmer, so let's just turn the aircon down a bit more or, fan yourself a bit. It has huge consequences for the intensity of storms and hurricanes, tornado. I mean, like Florida has got tornadoes generated by a hurricane. I mean, that's a mind-boggling concept if you think about it. A hurricane makes tornadoes, right?
Yeah.
So these are things which and then you get very bad floods. You get places where they have severe droughts for years. So the whole world is going to get messed up worse and worse. But why is it that it feels like the general population, governments, and especially big businesses aren't really bothered? It still feels like business as usual, and at the margins, let's kind of, recycle a few bottles. What's your sense? Why does it seem like the sentiment is not really one of urgency compared to the looming crisis?
Well, I think fundamentally the science is still disputed by some groups, obviously, right?
Right.
It's very political.
But are they credible groups?
Yes and no,
Okay.
right? Even scientists sometimes can't agree on certain things.
I
There's
see.
always uncertainty when you talk about
Okay.
the atmosphere, right?
Okay.
Because the Earth is not going to warm in a linear fashion, or climate
Sure.
change is not happening in the same way for everybody around the world. I often like to ask people if they've watched the show The Day After Tomorrow. I mean, it's a Hollywood film.
Yeah.
Right? Dennis Quaid, Jake
That's
Gyllenhaal.
right.
Actually, it came out, I think, 10 years
Years
ago
ago,
now.
yes, that's right.
And it's actually a great film because it shows you that it's not global warming in terms of like everybody's going to warm. It tells you that actually climate change, it literally is what it means. It's different for everybody
like
around the world.
Antarctica's becoming a green
so
place to live.
supposedly
Yeah.
North America is going to kick into an ice age
Yeah.
instead of warming, right? And so, I mean, to your question about why people don't seem to see the urgency is because I think some people think it's light years away, it's far away, it's not going to happen to me.
Okay.
But as we all know, it's already happening. Even
Yeah.
here in Singapore, right? Wasn't there just a few days ago rain in the western part of Singapore that was like 40, it's the highest in 40 years, right? So it's not happening sometime in the future, it's happening already.
But maybe that's the problem, because for some people it comes in milder effects and you feel like, oh, it's just a heavy rain day because
Exactly.
it's rain. It's not a hurricane,
Yeah.
which might force you to really take
Yeah.
things seriously.
Or it could be because we are desensitized, right? We see it all the time in
Right.
the news now.
Okay.
It's happening every day, every week, and people start to say, well, if this is such a common occurrence, it's not, and it's not affecting me, why should I really care?
Okay.
The other part is that, it's also this issue about systems change versus individual behavior.
Okay.
I think that sometimes while the governments out there are trying to effect systems change, those things take time, right, to effect. However, they still have to go out with like the general messaging to everybody that, okay, you still need to do your recycling. They're going to charge you for plastic bags. So both things have to happen in parallel.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can't do one or the other. All hands need to be on deck.
But is there a sense that some people are convinced that the systems change is proceeding very slowly because there are very powerful entrenched interests
Yeah.
who have a reason to preserve the status quo because of financial reasons or whatever?
I
Lobby
think,
groups
yes,
and
so you
stuff
hit
like
the nail
that.
on the head, right? That's exactly the case. For many countries, I think especially this is an extremely timely opportunity to talk about this because the next set of climate targets under the Paris Agreement are actually due in 2025. And so we'll actually see next year if countries are actually compelled to change their trajectories and reduce their emissions, or if they expect that they'll just continue business as usual for the next 10
Right.
years, right? My sense is that we probably have to manage our expectations because it's a challenging, situation right
Right.
now around the world geopolitically.
Right.
There's a lot of nationalism around the world as well. So I think governments are distracted
Okay.
with other priorities.
I see. Okay. So moving on to the part about, let's say, if we have to accept that things are going to be getting a bit worse first, what then can we do in the meantime from a mitigation point of view? Like what strategies can we employ individually, as companies, and as countries?
Well, I'm going to give you a very boring answer, right? Which is education,
Okay.
right? And but education has to be multi-pronged, right? It's not just in the schools, but also at home. We all have to educate ourselves about what are the levers that we can each individually as well as organizationally address. So, I mean, from a government point of view, if you want to tackle some big policies, you obviously need to speak their language.
Okay.
You need to hold the governments accountable in a way that they know how to be held accountable.
Okay.
So, for example, right now, Singapore government is hosting a public consultation on the next NDCs. Get your voice in, right? Fill out those forms before the 5th of November, for
Okay.
example. Then you get your voice in. From an organizational...
How does one fill out such a form?
Oh, you go on to REACH. There is a REACH public consultation that's
Right,
happening right
okay.
now. Yeah, and so you go on to the form.
Reach.
Yes, REACH is our
Okay.
Singapore government public
Yeah.
consultation arm, right? And so there are opportunities like that for citizens or
Mm-hmm.
permanent residents of any place to actually convey to the government what they think.
Yeah.
And it doesn't obviously have to be in a certain time frame. You can always write to them, write to your MP or
Sure.
whatever, right? So that's one, educating yourself enough to be able to respond to those opportunities. Within an organization, obviously thinking through if you have to do disclosures, educating yourself on the general sort of rules around that. If it's compliance, then no choice, you have to do it. But maybe if you're not currently required to report, maybe you want to start thinking about it, take some courses. There are plenty of courses out there right now, varying price ranges. So, and then obviously, as I mentioned, the schools is going to be really important. I happen to right now be on a review committee for some of the syllabus in lower secondary geography, and I can tell you that people are very concerned.
Okay.
They want to include sustainability in
Okay.
the program already.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
So-
yeah, it's a boring answer.
No, it's not quite, because the problem with a term like education is that it is so broad and all-encompassing that it can become quite unhelpful if it's left at that level of a word.
Yeah.
It's more useful if you say, okay, who precisely needs to be educated? Is it just the population in general via geography lessons? Or is it that some business leaders who are in a position to make choices don't really think this is a big enough problem because they don't understand the problem.
Yeah.
And for them, their primary concern is to generate revenue so that they can be accountable to their shareholders.
Yeah.
Is it educating business owners who are the shareholders to say that, hey, I'm prepared to accept that the return on my investment is not so great, but we need to shift towards more sustainable practices, for example. Is it governments who need to be educated to say that, look, you can do all you want to provide jobs and a safe environment for your people, but when the next gigantic storm comes and like houses are washed away, you have no answers for that, right?
No, it's everybody,
okay.
as you say, right? All the way from the leadership, all the way down to the average worker. I think everybody needs to be educated.
Okay.
Singapore, right here, we have a huge push, right? Government wants to be trained on sustainability, but again, earlier, the first question that you asked me, what is environmentalism?
Right.
How can one person be trained in everything from mitigation, adaptation on climate change to biodiversity, to air pollution, and how long do you have? How much money do you have? How much resources do you have and time to put towards education?
Okay.
So obviously, all of this needs to be thought through.
Sure.
And especially when you talk about just transition, right? You want to bring people along as you go. Obviously, the other part of the problem is who are going to be the educators. Right, experts available, ready and available to teach. Are universities, IHLs, institutes of higher learning prepared? Because their mandate is actually to teach undergraduates. But now we see there's also a demand for adult learners, right? And so I think some things have to change, have to be shifted in order to cater to this new group of adult learners. And now actually our Ministry for Environment is also saying it has to be credentialed, right? So it's not just like these exact education courses. You actually have to be. It has to be credit bearing.
Okay.
And then a bunch of hoops you've got to jump through as well.
Sure. Which is back to the point about educating and spreading a message as an advocate or activist. Do you find that sometimes it's frustrating as a person in that space who can see that this is a message that needs to get out there? We need the education to go out. But people don't want to listen and they're not interested. They don't think they should listen. And you then feel a bit like there's that annoyance, you're the naggy person in the room and the governments are like brushing you off to say, yes, we know, thanks very much, next. Do you feel like that sometimes?
I would, honestly, there's no time to feel like that.
Okay.
Because in the last few years, right, there's just been, finally the environmentalist wish has come true, right?
Okay.
Environmentalism and going green has gone mainstream.
Okay.
So when I started 10, 15 years ago, it was not like this, you're knocking on people's doors to ask them to do some research. You would pay, to do the research even, right? And they would say, all they need to do is give you the data.
Data, right, yeah.
But now things are totally different. People are knocking on our doors, asking us for courses to be run. But we're too stretched to be able to provide these courses in a timely and in a meaningful way.
Okay.
So we focus on a few. But I would say for the ones that we have, so the people who are in the room, I'm not worried about them. They want to listen.
Okay.
It's the people who don't know what they don't know. They don't know what they need to know. That, again, it's not that we don't want to care about these people, but I think we need to take the people who are interested along and then figure out a way to bring the rest of them along. But I think it's already mainstreaming. Average, SMEs, out there, small, medium-sized companies are also being asked by their clients about their scope 3 emissions, because everyone's emissions are somebody else's emissions, obviously,
right? Of course.
Yeah. So in this world where we're talking about carbon and everything we talk about is relating to a carbon constraint of some sort, right? Then everybody needs to be educated. I'll give you a personal anecdote actually. So my mom actually works in the aviation sector. She's corporate. She sells air tickets to corporate clients. And for the years that I've been telling her about environmentalism, I'm a geographer by training. She didn't know what I was doing, right? And then suddenly, like a couple of years ago, she's like, "Hey, why do we need to pay carbon tax on air tickets? My clients are complaining, right?" And she's like, "What is this scope 3? What is this ESG?" Because now the aviation sector is under the International Civil Aviation Organization is required to offset their emissions.
That's right.
And they're affected.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, that's mainstreaming.
But isn't it sad that you have to hit someone's wallet before they'll pay attention to something that could cost them their lives?
Yeah, but that's what works almost, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit more about this carbon credits? Because I think, again, as much as it's gone mainstream, there'll be some people who understand it, some people who don't. What is a carbon credit?
Okay, so I think fundamentally a carbon credit is generated when so you have a carbon project. It could be, let's say we talk about a project in the energy space. Okay, so if you had a coal-fired power plant and if you wanted to generate, if you know that if you had switched, right, and you displaced these emissions generated by coal and you put a solar power plant in its place, you can actually say that you've reduced X number of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that abatement, that reduction of emissions can actually be verified independently and it can be sold as a carbon credit. So it's equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions that you have removed or reduced from the atmosphere. Right. So that essentially, in that particular instance, example that I've given is a carbon credit. And why people use carbon credits is because sometimes they, as much as they try and decarbonize, these can be governments or organizations, as much as they try to reduce their emissions, turning off the lights, changing their chiller systems, it just doesn't work out that they'll get to zero, right? So they have some residual emissions that they may have to offset using somebody else's land, somebody else's resources to do so. They'll pay for it by way of the carbon price. And so increasingly moving forward, governments, so this voluntary market has been working for many years, at least 2 decades now. But now moving forward under the Paris Agreement, countries are actually starting to look to bilaterally trade with one another. And it's the system is becoming more robust in case people out there were a bit worried. And I know there are some worries about loopholes, the integrity of the carbon credits, the level of quality. There still remain, I think, a number of loopholes, which the scientists, especially, for example, in the center that I work in, are trying to resolve and trying to solve for. But these things take time because you actually literally need to go down to the forest and measure and check that the measurement, methodologies are accurate and can be improved over time as well.
Okay, so if an amateur layman like myself were to attempt to paraphrase what you just said, could it be described as if we want everyone or every organization or every company, whatever, to stick to a certain level of carbon emissions in your production of your goods and services. And some people are able to be even better than that. I can go beyond this limit to be even better in the way I reduce my emissions further than what I require to. And some people can't because of whatever reasons, again, circumstances around their business and so on. The company that has managed to reduce its emissions can sort of sell you that little bit of sort of benefit that I have managed to attain to offset what you have not been able to hit for your target. So in a way, it's a financial punishment for companies that don't meet whatever they are required to meet in terms of emissions, and it's a boon for companies that manage to, because they can translate that effort into a financial gain by selling the credit. Is that one way of looking at this? I would say
that's a fairly positive narrative that you've painted. The bad way of saying it is you're basically buying the right to pollute, right?
Correct. You're basically shifting the burden to other companies.
And that's how some people see it.
And especially the richer I am, it's almost like if you want to put it in a crude way, in a negative way, it's like I'm a rich guy and I pay someone to do national service for me.
Pretty much.
That's one way of describing it. But why would you frame it like that? I was under the impression that people who are in the environmental sector feel like it's not a perfect system, but it's better than none, where there's no accountability at all, right?
If it's increasingly going to be used as a way out, then I think that's bad.
I see.
Right. So some might say that if once you develop the infrastructure for trading carbon, for example, what's stopping you from using it completely? So I don't have to limit my emissions anymore.
That's right. I can just keep
buying as long as I keep buying, and I trickle down the cost to my consumers. Consumers are willing to pay the carbon tax. Like why am I stopping myself from growing?
Fair enough.
Right. So that's the risk. That's the risk that we're taking when we develop such projects. Of course, there's other things like carbon capture is the same, right? The perception by some groups is that it's used as end of the pipe. So you're still emitting, but you're just finding a way to capture the carbon, using technology.
Yeah, sequestration and stuff like that.
Exactly, right.
You're just basically sticking the pipe back into
pretty much
the ground.
Yeah, and some people are even thinking of using captured carbon dioxide to do enhanced oil recovery, right? So you're pumping up more oil from the ground when it was not accessible to you without technology intervention. So that's scary also. So you're not actually solving the problem, you're actually creating more emissions.
So what is the solution to the problem in an idealized scenario? Like assuming we leave aside all these powerful national and business interests.
Yeah.
From a pure theoretical scientist point of view, what should we do? And of course, whether we can do it or not is a separate question.
Yeah.
But what should we do?
We have to curb consumption.
Curb
I
consumption.
think that's probably...
Consumption of what?
Everything. It's simply because I think not saying it's us here in Singapore, but it's also the
I'm
world.
sure it's us in Singapore.
Partly, yes. I think we overconsume for sure. We know
Yeah,
this ourselves. But it's also that growth mentality, right? I think it's also a moral issue. Can you actually go and tell developing countries that they cannot grow at the same rate that you've grown? Can you stop their development? You can't. It's a moral issue.
In fact, some developing countries have used that against the developed countries to say you had your
chance, you industrialized,
and
why
you polluted the air for us, and now we can't, right? Is
exactly.
And so how do you deal with
so these are deep-seated ideologies, right, that continue into today. And I know a lot of developing countries, they are going to have to also confront the issue of mitigation as well as adaptation.
Sure.
Perhaps at a higher cost than the rest of us, because here we have the resources to adapt. Right, we can build Long Island. We can build the Stamford Canal. Widen the canal. We can do drainage works. But some places just don't have the resources to do that. Right?
No, and even when you do that, I mean, no offense to the government, I think these are all very important measures that would buy us time. But if this carries on, basically with no end to it, at some point, whatever you've done will not be enough because the sea levels will continue to rise.
All these are just projections, right? Like we can only project as much as we know based on data that we have.
Yep.
But again, as I said, Mother Nature is not operating in that basis. Like, you can handle it. I'll just send you this storm. No, right? It's
just
not
keep getting
linear.
worse and
it's
worse.
Uncertain.
You're right,
and we know it will get more intense. I think the projections are saying that we should expect more intense rainfall, and we at some point we might not even be able to predict.
That's right.
Anymore.
Because things can be so wildly out of whack that all your models are broken
We
immediately.
call this runaway climate change, right?
Yeah.
And we don't
or
know
the
what's
runaway
going to
greenhouse
happen
effect,
next.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this whole issue of seems to be centered around carbon primarily, because my understanding here is that the biggest problem is basically the carbon dioxide that comes out of almost all of the way we produce energy today, other than a few, like your green energy sources, solar, hydro, geothermal, and then nuclear, which is again one of those things which people thought. I found it interesting because I just read an article, I think this morning, about micro nuclear reactors that have been, and it's interestingly being funded and pushed by the tech companies who realize that they're going to need a lot more energy for their AI work, but they can't keep building power plants, because the political backlash against that would be great.
Exactly.
So ironically, it might be the tech companies who are the ones who are driving the change that we might need the most in the production of energy. Which
it's actually consumers at the end of the day, right?
Sure.
Yeah, because they're responding to consumer demand for AI applications and users, and they have to think of the energy solutions to power their businesses, and they're also under pressure to reduce emissions. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I feel like it's partly consumers. It's mostly the consumers, like we who want more, we want to grow, we want to develop. Not saying that we shouldn't. Obviously, we still have to continue, but how do we make things more efficient by way of energy production? So if people can, they should definitely be switching to renewable energy. Nuclear is an interesting option, right? Moving forward, it is a lower carbon intensity, so to speak, because it's obviously you use uranium, right, and not fossil fuel, so to speak. It is not it's not an infinite resource. Actually, it is finite.
Of course.
There's only so much uranium in the world.
Of course.
The issue, obviously, that people worry about is the potential fallout, the risk, radioactive water, if there's a fallout and so on, particles. So, but it does look like it's in many countries' futures, if you can manage the risk and contain potential fallout. But the important thing is that it displaces existing fossil energy.
Yes.
So if these tech companies in the end still they're using it to actually offset their increases in the use, but the base is still fossil energy.
Sure.
Then there's no difference. Actually, we're not emitting any less.
Sure. But I actually think that's that's one area where we might have some hope, because the tech companies are so powerful and so rich that they have the ability to do things that sometimes no one else can do. I mean, there are problems with this structure where, the CEO and the board of a big tech company can make like hundreds of millions of dollars on investment, and it's amazing.
Exactly.
Countries can't even do that.
Yeah.
But maybe that's the way forward, because sometimes you need a bold decision that isn't bogged down by politics and red tape and, sentiment on the ground. Like a tech company can literally buy a nuclear reactor that's existing, besides building new micro ones. That's something that's unheard of. Countries can't even afford to build a nuclear reactor, and a tech company can just buy one like that.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether in the end, that may be the direction that we have to go in, where the consumers, because of our awareness through education and our increasing sense that this is a problem we cannot ignore. It's all of our problems. But then we now use our power as consumers to effect the change via the companies that can, because people are talking about it enough, people are demanding enough of that. Say, hey, tell us, how are you supplying us this service? How is your energy for your service being sourced, and so on?
Yeah.
Maybe that could force the change that could be faster than for countries.
It will, but I think it may not be fast enough.
Okay.
I think the window of opportunity for us to mitigate and to try to reverse the trajectory of warming and climate change that we're on is fast closing.
Right.
Yeah, I think some people are saying within the next 5 to 10 years, if we don't reverse what we've already put out or try to change the trajectory, the runaway climate change will happen. And so then there will be havoc.
So again, to explain this for some of the listeners who may not be familiar with the term, runaway greenhouse effect or runaway climate change is the idea that once you reach a certain point, there's nothing you can do anyway, because the system has gotten so bad, it takes on a momentum of its own.
Exactly.
And it becomes impossible. So one of the things which like Al Gore's,
and we don't know when that is. That's the scary part.
And Inconvenient Truth already pointed that out in Al Gore's movie years ago, where one of the effects of global warming is that the polar ice caps are shrinking.
Yep.
And the polar ice caps serve a function of reflecting the sun's rays off.
Yes.
So when you have a smaller ice cap,
Yes.
more of the sun's energy is not being reflected off, it's being absorbed into the ocean.
That's
so
right.
then oceans are getting warmer faster.
Yes.
And so that becomes like, it gets faster and faster and faster
Yep.
to the point where nothing we do matters anymore. We basically messed up the world, and it's just going to become Venus at some point.
We are getting there, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yes. But this doomsday scenario is also something we need to check, right? Because
Sure.
I think some people will end up feeling super helpless.
Right.
And saying that whatever I do is not going to change anything anyway. And then they'll just continue to do what they've always been
Right.
doing, and more even.
We're going to
enjoy
die
my life
tomorrow,
lah.
let's
Yeah.
just eat and drink, that kind of
Correct.
thing.
Yeah, so we don't want that either.
Okay.
So there's a sort of careful balance that we need to strike here.
Sure.
Yeah.
So are there any other things that you feel like people can do more of? I mean, and I know that we've really reached a point where people feel a bit like, what else can I do as an individual? But again, we sometimes think of ourselves as only doing something because of our personal lives. Like, I need to stop using this, I need to stop doing this. But what about our professional lives? In our roles as people in organizations and companies, people as citizens who go to the polls every few years or have a voice like via Reach or whatever, is there more we can do in that space, not just changing the way we live and consume, but in the way we interact and make business decisions, make political decisions? Is there more that we can be doing?
I think so. Because obviously I operate in a space that talks about nature and climate almost every day. So I would say, I probably have been having these conversations for many years now. But I understand there might be people out there whose work probably doesn't even sort of venture into this climate space or environment space. So obviously the first thing, as I said earlier, is really just to find out more. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, obviously means that something must have compelled you to click and want to find out about sustainability.
You may be just bored at the airport
or
right
maybe
now.
Yeah. But anyway, I hope you learned something from this podcast. But it's really just to understand. Once you do develop confidence in being able to grasp the vocabulary and understanding. So what you were sharing from a lay perspective earlier, just breaking down the terms. I mean, that's important. We need translators. We need people to actually translate the complex science, the policies. to the average person or people who are just new to sustainability, right? And the more we do this, the more people build confidence and interest in the subject. Hopefully that will translate into action at the workplace. And even if it's turning off the lights more when you leave the rooms or implementing a 25 degrees Celsius policy in your office, I mean, that's a start, right?
Sure.
It's a start.
Sure.
It may look small to some people, but if you've never been doing it, then your baseline is zero.
I suppose what we're saying now is that we can do big change by a few actors, or we can have everybody make a little change and it still adds up.
It's not and all. I think everybody, so you need to do the big change definitely, and you need to do the small stuff
change
every single day. Yeah, and chipping away at it really is going to be, I think, for the average person, the most they can do, every day. It's just one person every day. But I am very, very encouraged by young people. I mean, I give talks in schools as well, and sometimes I get the word you used earlier is annoyed, they're ignorant. But I do find that nowadays young people are the ones that are seeking out this information. They want to know. They do feel a bit helpless. I don't know if you've heard this term eco-anxiety before.
Yeah.
It's a real problem.
Because this is the world they're going to have to live in more than...
They are already living in this tragic situation.
At some point, those of us from an older generation won't have to care.
And they're being told that this is their responsibility now even,
Right.
Yeah. So they're getting quite depressed and anxious about the future. Actually has huge implications. Some people don't want to have children because they expect...
You hear that,
You hear that a lot.
Right,
Actually, I think there are increasingly studies being done that decisions are being made because of the narrative that we're painting about the climate and the future that we have, that they have to inherit. And so this is going to have an impact, obviously, on fertility rates, on how countries survive, So this is very real. And unless we have something more positive to show the youth, I think the trajectory is going to continue.
Right. Yeah. Although the cynic might say, well, less humans equals a better hope for the planet, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but obviously we can't say.
I know. I mean, as in, if everyone was just a statistic, then that would be great. Less human activity, good for the environment. But on an individual level, that means people's hopes and aspirations get dashed because they feel like this world is a terrible place to bring a family into.
It is already happening, unfortunately. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not all doom and gloom,
No.
right? Because we have not reached that point where
there is a window of opportunity, as I talked about. And the science is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The authority on climate science has said that there is a window of opportunity. It's fast closing, but we shouldn't lose all hope just yet.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And in the meantime, are there particular things that certain countries like Singapore have to do more of because of our particular situation where we are, obviously more vulnerable in some ways and less vulnerable in others? I think like from a sea level point of view, we are certainly more vulnerable being an island, low-lying areas and so on. But we may not be so vulnerable to say like a hurricane because of the fact that we've got large land masses that surround us, compared to say an exposed island, like the Philippines or Japan or that.
Yeah.
So does it mean that our climate adaptation strategies all have to be very, very different from country to country and so on?
Well, I would liken this, my answer to what we said during the pandemic, right? Unless all of us are safe, no one is safe.
Okay.
Right? Especially when it comes to climate change as well. So
right.
even if Singapore were somehow able to erect some kind of seawall, Long Island to stave off sea level rise, as you've pointed out, our neighbors are also low-lying, right? The Philippines is archipelagic, so is Indonesia. It's going to be very challenging. And climate change is also seen to be a threat multiplier. There's going to be the situation of competition for resources, heat, water stress, among other things, food security issues, and not to even mention the climate refugee situation that we will face, right? People migrating because their lands become inhabitable. So all this is going to put a strain on defense and, other sorts of geopolitical concerns. So even if Singapore was safe, we could guarantee our citizens' safety, the rest of the region is burning or facing this crisis will not be safe, so to speak, also because we'll have to manage some of these expectations and the crisis that's happening around us.
That's a good point. Like, for example, when you have a very major river system that cuts across several countries, and then you now have problems with the river drying up, you're going to have trouble between these countries.
everything,
Yeah.
so we import food from everybody and
Right.
we import most of our goods from everywhere else. So if people suffer elsewhere, they're gonna close their borders. They're going to be nationalistic
That's
about.
right.
I mean, come on, look at what happened in the pandemic. Right?
That's right. Things won't get sold because you need to
Exactly.
reserve it for your local population,
I
and
mean,
that
people
affects
are up
us.
in arms about the egg situation and the raw
Chicken,
chickens,
yeah.
right? The fresh chickens. Then you
Sure.
can't eat your nice chicken rice because you're frozen only. These are very real concerns. I mean, yeah, they're not existential, so to speak, but it could happen in worse ways. Like basic staples might not be available to us anymore.
Yeah.
This is also why here in Singapore we're pursuing the 30 by 30
Yeah,
food security.
basically growing our own food to some
Exactly,
extent. Yeah.
but it's only 30%, so the remaining 70% is still going to come from the rest of our region or globally. I know we're trying to diversify, I think, our trade and to make sure that we get imports from elsewhere, but if the climate situation gets bad also, flights might not be able to take off, ships might not be able to sail, and then how are we going to get the food here also?
Right.
Yeah, but I know we're not supposed to make people feel like they can't do anything and it's doomsday scenario. But we somehow seem to keep circling back. The situation is pretty dire. So we obviously all need to be a bit more conscious about our consumption habits, right? So slowly, take it step by step. And this stuff can be really overwhelming also, right? So obviously people that I've spoken to, I also tell them, take a pause. It's not all on you, right? One person, we can't solve the problem ourselves. But, talk to people, trying to get your organization on board, get your government on board. I can say, I feel very lucky being here in Singapore that our government has the foresight to think about, 2100, think about the need to adapt, the need to build climate resilience. But I hope the same can be said for other places, right, in the region, because I stick to what I said earlier, we're not, we can't be all safe unless everyone is safe.
Right, right. So this has been great. We unfortunately are running out of time, and I always try to end with a slightly more personal question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering because you mentioned earlier that when you started doing all of this environmentalism things, years ago, there wasn't the kind of awareness. It hasn't gone mainstream like today. But knowing now what you know, if at the start of your career you could go back and tell your earlier version of yourself about doing something slightly different in the way you approach the topic or the way you tell people or the way you advocate, was there something you would tell your former self to say, hey, you should change your message to this, or you should focus on this because people didn't discover it until later, it was a big problem, but if you find it out now, it could maybe set things in motion earlier, something like that. Do you have anything that you feel was a wasted opportunity for people of your earlier generation in climate space?
I would say I have no regrets from, in terms of my trajectory. I wish, in fact, rather, it's a bit off tangent, but I wish I had the same amount of energy and fire as I did before now.
Oh, okay.
Because when you're younger, you have more energy and you ask more questions without fear of repercussion or fear of
so you are like Greta
anybody.
Thunberg in Singapore.
Last time 15 years ago. But now I feel like I'm more moderate, and I'm always thinking about the different sides of
Sure.
but I think what people need actually is sometimes you need to take a position.
Okay.
Right? And then there's more conviction in what you say. I've always told people around me that actually my position really hasn't changed. I've always been kind of a middle ground person, but because I'm middle ground now, the youth are more left. So it kind of looks like you're getting more right, like you're more right-leaning and more conservative in what you say and do. But actually, nothing really has changed for me. Almost maybe because the energy levels are so lower, I'm more busy, and then I don't have time for a lot of things.
Sure.
But I know that in the past, I used to ask a lot of challenging questions.
Okay.
I wish I could do more of that now.
Right.
Yeah, but
so it's the reverse.
It's the reverse.
You wish that your younger self were here today to bring that energy to the conversation.
But what I do feel, as I said earlier, I feel very comforted by the fact that younger people are taking on those roles now.
Okay.
And so almost I do feel also that if you didn't have asked the question, I would say it's good. Like other people are doing what I used to do, and I see a lot of me in them now, and I feel that I can also take a step aside,
Sure.
and focus on what I am actually doing, training people,
Right.
upskilling and trying to finish
And maybe
up my
empowering
studies.
them to take the message forward.
Exactly.
As well.
And then also
Okay.
teaching them that, sometimes it's okay to be moderate. You don't have to be angry and fired up all the time as well, because sometimes taking a softer approach,
It's more effective.
it's more effective.
Yeah.
Yeah. And often it is, right? When you're
Yeah.
talking to corporates, you have to speak their language, be more calm and not agitated. I mean, environmentalism sometimes it brings out not great
it's
things in
emotive.
people. It's very emotive.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think where we're trying to find some commonalities, really just to bring people together and talk.
Okay.
So you have to bring all the stakeholders, including your big so-called polluters, to the table. You can't cut them off.
Yep.
Because they're going to be part of the solution,
Yeah,
whether you
right.
like it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't quite answer the question.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Yeah. So, but anyway, let's hope that collectively we don't trash the only thing that we have
Gosh,
living.
there's no planet B.
Yeah,
Gosh,
exactly.
So cliche, but there really is no.
Well, there's
planet
kind of
B.
Mars, but it's a terrible second choice.
Oh
but
no!
yeah.
Yes.
Anyway,
Terrible.
thanks so much, Melissa.
You're
This
very
has been a
welcome.
great pleasure, and we learned so much today. And hope that maybe someday in the future we can have you back again.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.